Hello, welcome to week 9. Complete change in direction this week because we're switching from educational psychology, which has a very individualistic perspective on learning and schooling, to educational sociology, which has a much wider lens, as I'll explain as we go through the lecture. So the title of this week's lecture is Why Context Matters in Education, and what we're looking at is exploring the way in which students' context has bearing on their educational achievement and their experience of education and schooling. So you can see that the background that I'm using for this slide is a map of Newcastle, and it's divided up by SES. And so SES is short for socioeconomic status, and we can see that there's quite a disparity even in areas that are quite physically close together between some of the areas with low SES, which is in the red, and some of the areas which are very high SES, which is the navy blue, as well as areas that are in between. So we have sort of pockets of disadvantage and pockets of extreme advantage right here in Newcastle. And part of what we're doing across this module is exploring the impact that something like that particular context can have on educational outcomes, as well as a variety of other social factors. So when I'm talking about social factors or social groups, we're looking at the way in which we can kind of categorize people in social different social conditions. So different social groups might be male, female, high SES versus low SES, people with an Indigenous or Aboriginal Torres Strait Island background, people with a language background other than English. So there's a whole range of social groupings that we can apply to our students when we're looking at how they go in education. So what we're going to examine now is how students' social groupings, or the social group of which they're a part of, can impact on their educational attainment. So the data that I've got behind me is a list of NAPLAN results at Year 3, and the data comes from 2016. And what we're looking at is the percentage of students who have met the National Minimum Reading Standard. So that's what NMS stands for, National Minimum Reading Standard. And we're going to look at Year 3 students, what percentage have met the National Minimum Standards according to when we divide up the data by social factors, or according to what social group students belong to. So we can see that when we look at students, whether they're male and female, 97.3% of female Year 3 students are at or above the National Minimum Standards, compared to 94.4% of male students being at or above the National Minimum Standards. So that sounds quite interesting. I mean, look at this. We can see that we might talk about women being disadvantaged, but here we go in Year 3. There's 2.9% of females have met the minimum standards than males. But that slight gender difference kind of pales into insignificance when we look at some of the other social factors and the difference between the different social groups students are a part of. So we can look at students by indigeneity status, so Indigenous status, whether they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or not, and non-Indigenous students in Year 3. 96.4% of such students are at or above the minimum standard versus 87.6%. So we can see here that whatever's going on in the education system, there's a 8.8 percentage difference in the amount of students that are making the national minimum standards when we compare across students being Indigenous or not. Then we turn our attention to language background other than English, and we can see that it actually doesn't make an impact on whether students meet the national minimum standards. 95.8% of English-speaking students for whom English is a first language versus students who have a language background other than English, both are at minimum standards or above. Now, this is where we remind ourselves that looking at percentages is a pretty blunt instrument, because language background other than English has a wide range of disparities in the amount of students that count as having a language background other than English. So on the one hand, you have refugee groups, and those students tend to come to Australia and be considered to be quite disadvantaged and impoverished because they're often fleeing from really dangerous situations and may not be coming to Australia with any English background at all, versus skilled migrants, or the children of skilled migrants who have a language background other than English, but may not have the same economic disadvantage. So though it says there's no difference between English, the achievement of students for whom English is their first language, and students who have a language background other than English, under that, when we look at that social group of students with a language background other than English, we're hiding a lot of difference. We're hiding the fact that there are quite advantaged students in that group and quite disadvantaged students in that group, and the results kind of average that out and appear as though that group is not a significant social category to be concerned about. Now we look at geographical location, and we can see that when we consider the results of students living in our major cities, 96.4% of students are meeting the national minimum standards or above, versus 98.3% of students who are from a very remote background. So this tells us that there's some kind of disadvantage happening for our students that are educated in areas that are very remote. And there's a difference in achievement of 12.5%. When we combine a couple of these factors and look at geographical location of students who are Indigenous, the Indigenous students in the major cities, 90.2% of students in Year 3 are meeting or above the national minimum standards, versus 76.2% of students that are in very remote locations. And that's a 14% difference. And that's actually the biggest difference of all the categories that we're looking at on this graphic. So this tells us that there's something to do with not just Indigenous status alone, and not just geographical location, but that intersection of those two factors are creating a bigger disadvantage and a bigger gap. Now we look at parental education. So if your parents have a degree, students in Year 3, 98.3% of those students are at or above the national minimum standards. For students whose parents completed Year 11, 87.9% of students there are at the minimum standard or above. So there's a difference of 13.5% in who's achieving the minimum standard. So we can see that parental education has an impact on student success, and the better educated parents are, the more likely their students are to be meeting the minimum, their children are to be meeting the minimum standards. And when we look at parental occupation, not just the education, we can see that result very clearly as well. So parents in group 1, which is professionals, that is university educated people, and teachers sit in this group. 98.4% of those students are meeting the national minimum standards or above, whereas students whose parents are in group 4, which is more semi-skilled or unskilled labour, 93.2% of students are at or above the minimum standards, versus 88.2% of students whose parents are not in paid work. So it's not just to do with parental education, but also parental occupation can have an impact on whether a child is likely to be meeting the minimum standards or not. I mean, we can see here that across Australia, the vast majority of students are meeting the national minimum standards for reading in Year 3, but we can see that result is not uniform, and that in particular with social groups, those students are slightly less likely to be making those standards. And looking at this, that intersection of whether a student's Indigenous and living remotely puts them at a greater disadvantage than those students who are in the major cities, and students whose parents are not in paid work are less likely to be meeting the minimum standards. So the disadvantage and the learning difficulties are not randomly occurring, that there is these social factors that play into student success. Now, is this result uniform across Australia, or are we going to see slight difference in achievement when we drill down to various locations? Now, this graph in front of us gives us a bit of data on this, and we're looking at national minimum standards of students in grades 3, 5, 9 in 2014. And the first three bars on each of the bar graphs represent Year 3, Year 5 and Year 9 of non-Indigenous students, and the second three in each group represent the results of Indigenous students. So we can see that across all of the states in Australia, the 4 states in Australia that are represented here on the graph, that non-Indigenous students are meeting the minimum standards at a higher percentage than their Indigenous counterparts. Yet there are places in Australia where that gap is visibly wider, and we can see that in New South Wales and Victoria, the results of Indigenous students are not quite so far behind their non-Indigenous counterparts when we compare the results across to students in Western Australia and Northern Territory. So the results are not the same across Australia, and while the results of non-Indigenous students are roughly equal across the 4 states here that we're examining, there's quite a bit of disparity in terms of Indigenous students, and whatever's going on in Western Australia and the Northern Territory in 2014 is disadvantaging Indigenous students a lot more than the counterparts in New South Wales and Victoria are disadvantaged. So place also impacts we're not just talking about place in terms of remote versus major cities here, we're talking about what state an Indigenous student is being educated in is impacting on their results. And in fact, the results for Northern Territory are quite poor. We're looking at somewhere around 30% of the students, Indigenous students, meeting this national minimum standards versus around 90% for non-Indigenous. So using this data tells us something useful, and if we were educational policymakers, we might want to have a look at what's going on in New South Wales versus what's going on in the Northern Territory to try and, if we were serious about closing the achievement gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. What this graph also tells us is that being Indigenous doesn't mean that you are going to be massively disadvantaged. What it tells us is that it's that combination of being Indigenous and where you're educated that may amplify the disadvantage. So what I want you to consider is the use of sociology as a tool for unpacking these types of dimensions in the education system. It gives us a way of a lens, if you like, of looking at educational achievement. So we're going to turn our attention, so we've looked at the way in which educational outcomes are not evenly distributed throughout the system, and then we're going to spend the next few weeks thinking about why they're not evenly distributed, who's more likely to miss out, and for you as educators, a really important question, what you can do about it. And so sociology is a tool or a lens that you can use to kind of think about some of these issues. It gives you different sets of data than that obtained in educational psychology to bring to your classroom and to think in different ways about how we can help students. So sociology is the study of social life and the social structures that characterise and shape our identities and therefore our lives as social and cultural beings. So all of us are social and cultural beings. And we all have identities that are shaped by the different social groups of which we are a part of. And so there's a variety of social structures that shape our identities: family, religious organisations, school, and given the nature of this course, school is a social structure that we'll be putting under examination over the next 3 weeks. So, normally in a live lecture, I would get you to talk to the person next to you and think about what are some other social structures and how do they relate with one another. So you've probably got nobody next to you, but take a moment, pause the lecture if you like, and think about what are the other social structures in our society, how do they relate to one another. So this examination of the relationship so if you came up with the nation state as a social structure, you'd be doing very well. And you can think about the recent protests that have been taking place in Canberra and cities around the world to see that, the nation state, the government really is definitely a social structure that impacts on people, and people are trying to impact sort of back towards the government. So part of what sociology does is looks at the examination of the relationship of the nation state to the social groups within it, and we've seen that a lot of people are doing some examination between the nation state and women as a social group at the moment, and how the government determines or doesn't determine social policy. So sociology looks at solving particular problems, and it solves them in different ways and looks at different problems than what you'd find in educational psychology, which is very much about how people learn and the context in which they learn. So the types of questions that are under sociological investigation would be: what is society? How do different societies operate? How do people behave in social groups? Why do people organise themselves in social groups? How do different social groups form, and what way do different social groups intersect? How does an individual learn about him or herself as a social and cultural being? And how do we learn about the self and other? Because we often think about other people as cultural beings or social, but we don't necessarily turn that lens on ourselves. And sociology can be useful for that kind of thinking about how our own identity is formed and how our identity interacts and intersects with the identities of those around us. Why do we want to live together, and what is the basis for choosing the social groups with which we want to associate and the ones with which we do not want to associate with? So we might think of ourselves as well-rounded, open-minded people, but that still doesn't mean that we want to associate with absolutely everybody. So in what social groups are you comfortable hanging out with, and what social groups make you uncomfortable? So I just had another son have another birthday, so I had a weekend full of teenagers in my house. And you know what? I'm not actually real comfortable hanging around with 15-year-old boys. I like them. I'm get on quite well with my son, but that's not a social group that it's entirely appropriate for me to socialise with. And I prefer to hang out with people my own age and people with similar life experiences. So that's just one cheeky example of no matter how accepting and open-minded we are, that we don't belong in every group, and we all have boundaries and reasons for feeling comfortable in particular areas and with particular people and particular associations, and for not feeling as comfortable and as welcome with other groups and other associations. So sociology is a huge branch of social science, and there's a sort of, if you can think of something, there's probably a sociology of it. So there's a sociology of careers, a sociology of digital technology, sociology of winemaking, sociology of health, a whole range of things that explore various social interests and social groups. However, obviously in this course, our focus is the sociology of education, because the education system is a very important sociological structure. Schools are one element in our system that is society, and we're very interested in the purposes of schooling. So social institutions such as schools are not just a place to go to learn some knowledge and skills in preparation for a workforce. There's a whole range of other social dynamics taking place within schools. So schooling is a formalised way of transmitting the norms, values, attitudes, and accepted behaviours of broader society. So we're not just transmitting curriculum knowledge, we're also transmitting values, norms, attitudes, and behaviours. So can you think of another important social site that also transmits norms, values, attitudes, and accepted behaviours? So I'm hoping you said family, because that is an important site for transmission of those sort of things, but also media, pop culture. There is other social sites that do this values transmission. So educational sociologists investigate a whole range of things. They look at, for example, the history of contemporary social structures. So they will explore what prompted the introduction of mass education, and has it really benefited everybody? What are the conditions of female teachers, and how are they different to male teachers? Educational sociologists will investigate diversity or variation in the life experiences of individuals and the consequences of these variations, both for the individuals and for society as a whole. So we might look at the way in which schooling suits some particular groups of people, and yet 1 in 4 students are feeling disengaged and not valued and not like they're going to succeed in the school system. So what are the implications for Australia as a whole if 25% of students don't succeed in school? What are the implications for that 25%? Sociologists also investigate how we make sense of our social differences and how some differences are stigmatized and other differences are celebrated, and why does social inequality exist and why does it perpetuate. So there's a whole range of really interesting questions that educational sociologists investigate. So there's themes for research within the sociology of education, and one of them is, if we accept the premise that there is no one social group that is more intelligent than another, so we're talking socioeconomic status, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and the fact that none of these groups or none of these definitions make anyone more intelligent than another one, and this point has been well established for more than half a century, then why do some social groups succeed educationally more than others? And what are the ways that social inclusion and exclusion operate in schools? In what ways do schools reproduce the status quo or are transformational? So, we've had mass schooling, or schooling that's available for everybody, for more than 100 years, and yet and part of the argument for that was that it would allow success across all different groups, and yet we're seeing the same groups succeed and the same groups be disadvantaged. So we might argue that schools are more that there's a process of social reproduction happening through schools rather than a process of social transformation. How does our education system intersect with some of the other sociological institutions, such as the family, our legal system, our economic system? What role does curriculum, pedagogy, teach quality play in educational success? In what ways do schools affirm or deny individuals their cultural and social identity? So some students will go to school and feel that their cultural social identity is accepted, praised, affirmed at school, and others will find that their identity is denied. They're not represented in the curriculum. The things that they're interested in aren't valued or celebrated at school. And another theme for research in sociology of education is schooling in a globalized world. So how do the changes in political, economic and cultural structures change schools, and how alike and different are schools across our global world? There's a number of key themes in the sociology of education. A number of one of the things that can kind of impact on people's success or lack thereof in education, and one of the central themes is place. And it's no coincidence that I started this lecture with a diagram of Newcastle as a place. So place has been defined in various ways. One way that place has been defined is as centres of experience. Places teach us about how the world works and how our lives fit into the spaces we occupy. Further, place makes us, as occupants of particular places with particular attributes, our identities and our possibilities are shaped. So when you think about that definition, you can see how schools are a significant place. They're a place where our identities and possibilities for our life are shaped. Thrift explains that place as the innumerable interactions between things and bodies which are placed at particular locations. Therefore, places are politicized and cultured. They are humanized versions of space. So space and place are both important geographical concepts, but the space is more abstract. It's this we might define it by it being at a particular address, but place is a sense where meaning is made. So if I were to go to Denmark and find myself in an old castle, if I'm looking around, it's an old castle, it's a historical space. But if someone said this is the castle where Hamlet was set, then all of a sudden this old castle, not just a historical space, but it becomes imbued with a sense of place. It's something important, and there's documents about the events that supposedly happened in that place. There's meaning attributed to that space, and that's how space becomes place. The ways students explain and construct a sense of belonging to a place or understand themselves in others and the world in relation to the places they inhabit, that these are part of why place is an important construct, and school is a place. It's a place where, we spend our formative years. We make sometimes lifelong connections with other people. We get our initial sense of ourselves as a learner, and the things we like to learn about, things we don't like to learn about, how we like to learn, and it often sets people up for their life trajectories. So when we think about schooling in Australia, we like to think of Australia as the land of the fair go, but we can see that different students are being educated in different types of schools. And so if socioeconomic status had no bearing on education and students were evenly distributed between the different types of schooling systems in Australia, what we would see is every schooling system would look the same. In the bottom quartile of SES, each school would educate 25% of people from that quartile, 25% from the second quartile, 25% from the third quartile, and 25% in the top quartile of socioeconomic status. If the different types of schools were evenly distributed, if education was evenly distributed across the socioeconomic status. However, what we've got in front of us is data that shows very clearly that that's not what happens. And in our government schools, our public schools educate 22% of students from the top quartile, and independent schools educate 47% of students from the top quartile. Independent schools educate 13% of students from the bottom or the lower socioeconomic quartile, while government schools educate 36% of students from the bottom quartile. So the government schools educate more of our students from the lower socioeconomic quartile than any of the other systems, and also educate fewer from the top quartile than any other system. So we can see that socioeconomic advantage is more prevalent in the independent sector, and slightly higher in the Catholic sector than it is in the government sector. So there's not an even distribution of socioeconomic backgrounds throughout the three school sectors in Australia. So now we're going to try to apply some of the tools that sociology gives us to an investigation of educational outcomes. And so in 2010, which I know was a while now, but it's been a long time since the state government kind of publicly released these types of results, the New South Wales, what was then the Department of Education and Communities, had a look at the relationship between NAPLAN results and students' individual socioeconomic status and the socioeconomic status of the school. Now, this is New South Wales is the largest education system in Australia, and between 60 and 70% of Australian students are educated in public schools. So state schools educate the majority of students with disabilities, the majority of students from rural and remote backgrounds, and the majority of students from low SES backgrounds. So it's worth looking at that relationship between socioeconomic status and educational achievement. And how, in the report that we're about to look at, the findings of, socioeconomic status is derived from a combination of students' parents' occupations and school and non-achievement, and not school and non-school achievement levels, and whereas school socioeconomic status is derived from on the average of students' family SES levels. So there's slightly different measures of socioeconomic status that are be used between the individual and the school level. Now, what we can see here is we're looking at Year 3 results of NAPLAN in the state schools in New South Wales, and we've divided the students up by their results by socio-economic quartile. And so the dashed green lines represent a student and who's average for that quartile, whereas the unbroken lines represent students' results from the various quartiles depending on the quartile of the school. So let's see if I can explain. So if we don't look at schools, if we just look at students from the bottom socioeconomic quartile score just under 390 in the NAPLAN results, whereas students from the top socioeconomic quartile score around about 465. So there's between the four quartiles, there's quite a jump in educational achievements based on the economic status of a particular student. And so students in the second quartile achieve higher than students in the first, students in the third achieve higher again, and then the best achievements are those whose background is in the top quartile. However, these indicate where schools sit, and so we have schools whose average is in the bottom quartile, schools whose average is in the second quartile, schools whose average is in the third quartile, and schools whose average is in the top quartile. And we can see that when we put students from the bottom SES quartile, the higher the average of the school, the better result that student can achieve. So if we put a student from the lowest quartile into a school that its average, the highest quartile, we're lifting that student's result up above the second quartile. So they're jumping up more than a quartile's worth. There's a gain of more than a quartile worth of average by putting a low SES student in a high SES school. And when we put students from the highest quartile, students from the least disadvantaged background into a disadvantaged school, we're dropping their results. They're dropping back to as though their background was from the third quartile, but we're lifting them up a bit when we put them in a high SES student in a high SES school. Now, so this is year 3. Have a think about what the results are likely to look at if we consider the same dynamic for year 9 students. So there's 6 years more of education taking place, and are we able to kind of flatten the curve, so to speak, and minimize the differences through 6 years more educational intervention, or are those results going to be more pronounced because whatever dynamics caused that continues over the next 6 years? What do you think the graph for year 9 is going to look like? Well, as you can see, the dynamic is way more pronounced. If we take a student so you can see that just looking at the average quartile of individual students, by year 9, the gap between students from the third to the fourth quartile has widened. When we start thinking about which quartile the students themselves are from and which quartile the school that they're based in goes, we can see that putting students from the lowest quartile into a school in the lowest quartile drops their performance a bit. However, if we can get those students going to schools based on the highest quartile, we're lifting their results up till they're between the third and fourth quartile. Students from the fourth quartile, if we put them in a lower SES school, drop back down to the same results approximately as students from the third quartile, and richer students in richer schools tend to have a boost. So this dynamic is more pronounced the longer students stay in school. So what the Department of Education Communities report found was that while an average student's SES has an impact on their outcomes, this varies depending on the average SES of the other students in their school. So it's not just a student's individual background that has an impact on their educational attainment, it's also the background of the students with whom they're sharing the school. So these results indicate that irrespective of which SES quartile a student belongs to, their score on average improves if they enroll in a higher SES school. A low SES student will, on average, achieve a higher score than the average of all quartile 2 students if the quartile 1 student is enrolled in a quartile 4 school. Student scores improve by 1/3 and 1/2 of a standard deviation if they are enrolled in a high SES school, Q4, rather than a low SES school. The effect of school SES on a student performance is profound and exists across the SES spectrum. These findings point to the strong independent effect of concentrations of disadvantage at the school level over and above the SES of individual students. Now, this was a department report. This is not some left-wing organisation. This is actually the New South Wales Department of Education and Communities' investigation into the findings within its own schools. And so it highlights the fact that there are massive achievement gaps between students from different social groups in Australia. And there's some evidence that this gap has increased over the last decade. So students from high SES families have much higher educational outcomes than students from low SES families. 41% of students from low SES families fail to complete Year 12 as compared to 22% of students from high SES families. On average, 15-year-old students from low SES families are over 2 years behind their high SES counterparts in reading, maths and science. In 22 to 23% of students from low SES families do not achieve the expected international proficiency standards in reading, maths and science. So we can see that schools are not, the educational benefits of schools are not evenly distributed and are not extended as well to low SES students than they are to high SES students. And so the problem is that if there was no meaning to it, if meeting the standards didn't have any bearing on your options post-school, then it wouldn't matter so much. But there is an impact on education or relationship between attainment and post-school options. So we can see that in 2009, Year 12 attainment rates for students from low and medium socioeconomic backgrounds were 56% and 62% respectively, compared to 75% from students in high socioeconomic backgrounds. So although this data doesn't hold true as much today because more students are staying to Year 12 than before, we can see that the higher a student's socioeconomic background is, the more likely they were to attain a Year 12 higher school certificate. In Year 10, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds were less likely to attend university. The university access rates for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds was around 17%, compared to 35% from students from high socioeconomic background. Students that do not acquire basic literacy and numeracy competencies early on are more likely to require additional and potentially expensive intervention in later years, and are also at higher risk of not completing Year 12 or an equivalent qualification. People with lower educational levels typically have higher unemployment risks, hold less stable jobs, and are more likely to experience periods of welfare dependency. So there is a relationship between school achievement and post-school options, and how likely your life is to go well and you hold down a stable job or get university or other post-school qualifications. And the less likely you are to experience periods of welfare dependencies. So what's interesting about this research is that students from low SES backgrounds enrolled in schools with a high proportion of students from similarly low SES backgrounds are nearly 4 years behind students from high-income families in high-income schools. In other words, while a student's own family background has an important impact on achievement, the collective socioeconomic status of the school students that they're enrolled with matters a great deal too. The company students keep at school, their peers and their teachers, significantly impacts on educational achievement. So we can see here that we've identified an inequity, that it really matters the collective socioeconomic status of a school where students are sent. So what I want you to think about is what factors might contribute to this achievement gap, because we don't go around giving out HSC results based on how rich somebody's parents are. They have to undergo tests and earn and demonstrate educational achievement. So why are students in low SES schools not producing the same results when we look at these averages? So, schooling that segregates by socioeconomic status, which is what we're developing patterns of doing that here in Australia, is most likely to benefit students who are already advantaged and most likely to harm those who are already disadvantaged by a low socioeconomic status background. Perry and McConney argue that educational policies that work against the segregation of students in schools based on SES could be pursued on the basis that these are likely to achieve better and more equitable education outcomes for all. And they give the example of Canada and Finland, which outperform Australia on PISA, and where the relationship between socioeconomic status and student achievement is lower. So our new Federal Education Minister, Alan Tudge, gave a speech a couple of weeks ago talking about how our results are falling and we need to go back to basics. Now, Laureate Professor Jenny Gore argued in a newspaper response to that that's a simplistic notion that doesn't take into account other factors such as socioeconomic status that impact on students' achievement. And all that going back to basics does is bore students, and it doesn't allow them to extend, and no wonder we don't see good educational results if we keep hammering over the basics. Perry and McConney would argue that if we wanted to see Australia's students' results improve, that we need to more evenly and equitably distribute our students to different schools rather than having poor students in poor schools and rich students in rich schools, and that's why we're seeing this kind of long tail of educational disadvantage. So why is there a school level socioeconomic status effect, which is what I asked you 2 slides ago to think about? I hope you thought about it. What did you come up with? Did you come up with thinking about different communities holding different values? Did you consider that schools might assess students differently based on teachers' ideas of what students could achieve? Did you think that the curriculum might be delivered differently across different schools? That where we have rural and remote schools, it might be harder to get teachers there, or might be harder to keep teachers there, so you don't have the same continuity. What about the support that teachers have available to them, or the fact that we're stratifying our communities? What about social capital, which is something we'll explore in later weeks, and cultural capital, so the degree to which parents can help with student schooling and help with schools raise money and funds. So there's a whole host of sociological things we could explore that might go some way to explaining why we have this socioeconomic status gap when we look at educational attainment. Alan Luke, a now retired professor in education in Australia, says that we know that class is not a standalone determinant, but works in a relationship to gender, ethnicity, race, affiliated culture and subcultural context, linguistic disposition and sexual preference of the student. So while today's lecture has really concentrated on looking at the relationship between educational attainment and socioeconomic status, we know that this socioeconomic status, or student's class, isn't a standalone determinant, that all students are made up of more than just their class, that they have gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And all of those other factors also contribute to student success or lack of success. And so we have this system where some students are feeling included, welcomed, celebrated, and their identities are affirmed in schools, and other students are feeling excluded, and their identities are denied in school. So we can think about this and talk about this in terms of mechanisms of social inclusion and social exclusion. Back to the beginning of the lecture, I said we were all members of various social groups, and all social groups operate in an understood but not often talked about hierarchy. And within the social groups, there's a taken for granted norm that we measure others against. And so in sociology, we talk about these, we don't talk about these taken for granted norms using those words. We use this idea of normative constructions. So think about these dualisms: male, female, black, white, gay, straight, English speaking, non-English speaking, Australian, non-Australian, urban, rural, rich, poor. So we can see that we've got ways of dividing people into different groups, and often in those divisions, one part of that dualism is valued more highly than the other. Now, there's nothing wrong with difference, because difference is part of society, but the problem is when we start excluding people or making more meaning out of that difference than actually exists, or saying that, when we break things up into these dualisms, that one half of that duo is more important or more valuable than the other half. So in some groups and in some situations, we will feel included, and in others we feel excluded, and this dynamic can shift and change over time and in different contexts. Think about your behaviour with your friends, the things that you talk about, the way you act. Would some people feel uncomfortable or left out if they were part of your group, and what things would make them feel included and what things would make them feel excluded. And we see these dynamics playing out in schools all the time. So when we think of exclusion, at the same time we need to think of inclusion, because they work together. They're different sides of the same coin, and you can't have one without the other. And so what I've got above me here is a graphic explanation of inclusion and exclusion, integration and segregation. So there's true inclusion is the this diagram, but often we see patterns that look like exclusion, segregation or integration, particularly if we think about how students with additional and special needs in schools, how they're included or not. So I've filled you with some doom and gloom, looked at the way that schools can be exclusive and the way that the achievement is not evenly distributed in schools. What can we do to help? You're a motivated educator who wants to make a difference in the world. What can you do? Well, we can think about, and we will over the next 3 weeks, the system, the structures of schooling, public versus private, who has access to early childhood and care, the different systems in school of primary, secondary, tertiary education. We can think about curriculum. So does a national curriculum work for all our students? Is it actually the same in Northern Territory as it is in New South Wales? Are we actually enacting the curriculum the same way? We can think about pedagogy, different styles of teaching. So what teachers choose to teach, the knowledge construction and how they teach it, relationships of power, and how this might impact on educational achievement. And we can think about types of assessment that's used in school and the fact that the government likes high stakes standardised assessment that treats all students as being the same. So there's a few really pragmatic things we can look at that really come to the heart of teachers' work and consider ways in which when teachers are doing their work, they can do their work that is transformative rather than socially reproductive. I'll leave that there. I hope everyone manages to stay dry, and I look forward to catching you later.